Testing one, two, three. Okay. Welcome. 12 October. How time flies. I'm gonna look a little bit at David Basu's A Marxist Theory of Rent. I only included the bookends of the article, mainly because the rest is math. But a good math. I mean, it has comparative statics and a whole bunch of other stuff. But I think the real point is to get onto a comparison of Marx 20 years earlier than this. But before we do that, let's look at this, because I think this will create some sort of perspective, maybe. This paper offers an analytic treatment of a Marxist theory of rent. I highlight the key role played by the price of the agricultural commodity in determining rent. I offer two closures of the model. The first closure is an elaboration of Marx's argument in volume 3 of Capital, which is what we were just looking at with the folks Mosley translation, and which does not have any role for demand. The second closure extends Marx's analysis by explicitly allowing for the role of demand. And I also show that the role of demand addresses some of Mosley's points, a question that he raised to Heinrich. Anyway, I also show that total rent may be decomposed into three components. That is absolute rent, differential rent 1, and differential rent 2. I emphasize that a Marxist theory can explain rent in any system of capitalist commodity production which uses privately owned, non-reproducible resources. Hence, it is applicable far beyond the domain of agriculture and can be used for analysis of rent in other sectors, like, among others, oil and natural gas, mining, and real estate. In the discipline of economics, introduction. In the discipline of economics, there are at least two different conceptions of rent. The first conception comes from the work of Vilfredo Pareto and conceptualizes rent as the excess return to a factor of production over its next best alternative use. This notion of rent is the dominant way of conceptualizing economic rent in contemporary economics. It's been used in the influential literature on rent-seeking activities and the negative impact on economic growth and efficiency. There is an alternative and older conception of rent that comes from classical thinkers like David Ricardo and Karl Marx. In this alternative understanding, rent is conceptualized as the fraction of national income appropriated by owners of scarce, non-reproducible resources that can be used in the process of production. Here, the focus is explicitly on the distribution of income between the fundamental classes of society. A neoclassical interpretation of this alternative classical conception of rent can replace social classes with factors of production and thinks of rent as the excess return earned by a factor of production over what would be necessary to induce it to do its work. All of these come from Vessel, 1967. In this paper, I will work with the classical conception of rent as a fraction of national income and investigate the economic mechanisms that can account for its emergence. In particular, I will develop a unified analytical account of the classical theory of rent presented in Volume 3 of Capital, which is what we were just looking at. In the 3 volumes of Capital, Marx offers a penetrating critical analysis of the structure and long-term dynamics of the capitalist mode of production. The analysis and presentation in Capital is organized into 3 volumes and conducted at 2 different levels of abstraction. Volumes 1 and 2 operate at the level of what Marx calls capital in general, where competition between capitals is abstracted from, and Volume 3 operates at the level of many capitals, where competition is introduced back into the analysis. In terms of substantive issues in Volume 1 of Capital, Marx analyzes the process of production of capital, that is, the process of the generation of surplus value through the exploitation of labor and the accumulation of surplus value to create additional capital. Footnote 1. After analyzing the issues related to the realization of surplus value in Volume 2, Marx takes up the analysis of distribution of surplus value in Volume 3 of Capital. Marx's analysis of the distribution of surplus value in Volume 3 proceeds in 2 analytically separate steps. In the first step, the total surplus value generated in production is distributed across different sectors through the competition between industrial capitals. Footnote 3. Competition is manifested in the mobility of capital across sectors in search of higher rates of profit. The long-run equilibrium of this competitive process is the emergence of an average rate of profit across all sectors, supported by prices of production, which necessarily implies a redistribution of the different magnitudes of surplus value generated across sectors due to the differences in the organic compositions of capital. In the second step, some of the surplus value appropriated by industrial capital is further redistributed to other fractions of the ruling class as commercial profit, ground rent, and interest. Now, while Marx was clear that ground rent could arise in any sector that used natural resources for commodity production, he offered most of his analyses in terms of the specifics of agricultural production. The emergence of ground rent in agriculture requires, according to Marx, 2 conditions: a lower than average organic composition of capital in agriculture and the presence of landed property, where with landed property comes the monopoly of use of the land. Quote, landed property presupposes that certain persons enjoy the monopoly of disposing of certain portions of the globe as exclusive spheres of their private will to the exclusion of others, close quote. Now, the first condition, lower than average organic composition of capital in agriculture, gives rise to higher than the economy-wide average rate of profit. Marx refers to this as surplus profit. The second condition, the presence of landed property, erects what Marx calls an absolute barrier to the mobility of capital. The impediment to the free movement of capital into agriculture has 2 effects. It prevents the surplus profit from flowing away from agriculture, as would have happened if there were no barriers to the mobility of capital into agriculture. And equally importantly, it allows this surplus profit to be appropriated by the class of landowners, i.e., the owners of the land as ground rent. Now, Marx's theory of ground rent outlined above raises 2 questions. The first question relates to the domain of applicability of the theory. Is Marx's theory of ground rent applicable beyond agriculture? The answer is in the affirmative, as Marx himself emphasized. The theory of ground rent can be applied to any sector of capitalist commodity production which uses a non-reproducible natural resource that is privately owned. Hence, the analysis can be applied to other sectors like mining, oil and natural gas, real estate, and tourism. But this immediately raises the second question: how important is the assumption of lower than average organic composition of capital? If the assumption of lower than average organic composition of capital is crucial for the logic of the emergence of ground rent, then it is doubtful if Marx's theory can be applied to any sector at all. Not only is mining, oil, and natural gas and real estate as capital intensive as the rest of the economy, it is no longer possible to assert that even agriculture is less capital intensive than the rest of the economy, other than in some developing countries. This signifies the kind of the difference between the 19th century and others in terms of uneven development. The main contributions of this paper is to develop a consistent, unified Marxist theory of rent. Footnote 4. In developing this theory, I will use the term land for any non-reproducible natural resource that is privately owned and that can be used in the production of commodities. I will use the term agriculture to refer to the economic activity of producing some commodity on the land, and I will use the term agricultural commodity to refer to the commodity that is produced on the land. After setting up the basic model, I will highlight the key role played by the price of agricultural commodity for the theory of rent. Footnote 5. I offer two closures of the model. The first closure is a development of Marx's argument in Volume 3 of Capital. It relies on the juxtaposition of lower than average organic composition of capital and barriers to mobility of capital to explain rent. In developing this closure, I show that there is one significant way in which Marx's account needs to be amended. Just lower than average organic composition of capital is not sufficient for generating rent. A stronger concavity condition about the lower organic composition of capital in agriculture is needed. The second closure extends Marx's analysis in several significant ways. First, unlike the analysis in Volume 3 of Capital, this closure allows for a direct role of demand. Footnote 6. Hence, unlike Marx's analysis in the contemporary neo-Ricardian analysis, where the output of the agricultural commodity is taken as given, I allow for the joint determination of the output and price of the agricultural commodity, the latter, in turn, determining the magnitude of rent. Second, it moves away from the analysis of Volume 3 of Capital by dispensing with the assumption of lower than average organic composition of capital. This is very important because it now increases the applicability of the Marxist theory of rent to a wide range of contemporary contexts where the assumption of lower than average organic composition of capital can no longer be justified. In developing the Marxist theory of rent, the paper connects with several strands of extant literature. First, it speaks directly to the large Marxist literature on rent. Eaton, Mendel, Fine, Rubin, Ghosh, Foley, Howard and King, Samuelson, and Ramirez. The main contribution of this paper with respect to the existing Marxist literature is that I formulate the theory of rent. Marx used a series of often confusing examples in Volume 3 of Capital to illustrate his arguments. Later authors followed him in presenting arguments, mostly with the help of examples. Yes, indeed. Footnote 7. Specific examples are driven by specific assumptions, and so it is not possible to understand the general logic of the argument with the help of examples only. A formal mathematical framework, on the other hand, can help us grasp general arguments. Footnote 8. And second, it indirectly speaks to the contemporary neo-Ricardian literature, this is the Straussian literature, on rent. Within the classical tradition, the theory of rent was elaborated most clearly by David Ricardo, which was further developed by Piero Sraffa. A clear, formal treatment of the neo-Ricardian theory of rent in a general N-sector, and it's in Norman, N-sector economy with linear technology can be found in Kurtz of 1978. The Marxist theory of rent that I develop in this paper differs from the neo-Ricardian literature on rent in several ways. Now, while the neo-Ricardian analysis uses a general equilibrium framework, the Marxian theory developed in this paper is a partial equilibrium analysis. The shortcoming of the shortcoming of the theory developed in this paper comes with certain advantages over the general equilibrium non-Ricardian. The shortcoming of the theory developed in this paper comes with certain advantages over the general equilibrium neo-Ricardian analysis. The neo-Ricardian analysis uses linear technology, but the Marxian theory allows for non-linear technologies. The neo-Ricardian analysis does not have any place for demand and conducts the whole analysis by taking the level of output of the agricultural commodity as given. In contrast, the Marxian theory developed in this paper allows for the role of demand in jointly determining output and price of the agricultural commodity. The latter, in turn, determining the magnitude of rent. Finally, the neo-Ricardian analysis does not allow for the existence of absolute rent. The Marxian theory not only explains absolute rent, but accords it an important place in the whole analytical framework, footnote 9. Third, it connects to the outgoing critical literature on land rent and urban housing, while the traditional understanding of high rent and prices of real estate in urban areas is often seen zoning regulation as a key causative factor. The emerging critical literature digs deeper into the reasons for limited supply and tries to identify different classes that benefit from the restricted supply. Now, this paper offers a coherent theoretical framework that could inform discussions on rent in critical urban studies. Before we turn to the details of the analysis of rent, it is important to remember that its existence highlights for Marx just another aspect of the irrationality of capitalism. For rent derives from proprietary rights over parts of the earth and its natural resources, a fact is absurd. Yes, that's the ownership of one human being by another human being. The analysis of rent is therefore at one and the same time an indictment of the absurdity of capitalist social relations. The rest of the paper is organized as follows. In section 2, I introduce the basic setup. In section 3, I define the terms surplus profit and rent, discuss the three components of rent, and highlight the key condition for the existence of rent. In section 4, I develop the first closure of the model of rent, which is an elaboration of the argument of Marx in volume 3 of Capital, which we just looked at. In section 5, I develop a second closure of the model that extends Marx's analysis by explicitly incorporating the role of demand in profit-maximizing behavior of capitalist farmers. I conclude the discussion in section 6 with some caveats and ideas about extension. Now, I won't describe the comparative status because that describes an earlier thing, and I've cut out all that math stuff and just went to the conclusion, right? So we'll do the conclusion and then move on to early Marx, 1844, 20 years before at least the volume 3 that we've been working with. Just for comparison. And, the younger Marx has a close point of view, but clearly has other things on his mind. In this paper, number 6, this is section 6 of Basu's paper. In this paper, I've developed a Marxist theory of rent. In developing this theory, I have used the term land for any non-reproducible natural resource that is privately owned and that can be used in the production of commodities. I have used the term agriculture to refer to the economic activity of producing some commodity on the land, and I've used the term agricultural commodity to refer to the commodity that is produced on the land, period. An immediate implication is that the Marxist theory of rent developed in this paper is applicable for far beyond agriculture proper. It can be applied to any situation where a privately owned, scarce, non-reproducible resource See, you could apply that to NFTs, right? Can be used in a capitalist commodity production. For instance, in sectors like mining, oil and natural gas, real estate, and even tourism. In such situations, owners of the resource can bargain away a fragment of the surplus value or national income over and above wages generated in capitalist commodity production. This fragment of surplus value, you can see this sort of exemplified here, and it has its comparative statics. So you can see that there is a square or a rectangle, actually, HBCD, this square here. Total rent is in the new scenario is given by the area of the rectangle, as you might expect, B prime, which is more, C prime, which is more, D prime, which is more, H prime. So you can see this first square expands slightly, and this margin is an interesting, it is what we're sort of considering an exogenous increase in the demand for the commodity produced on land. Total rent in the original situation is the smaller rectangle. Total rent in the new scenario is given by the area of the bigger rectangle. And you can see that it describes a single moment of movement, whereas, obviously there's a lot more going on. So anyway, back to the text. This fragment of surplus value is what classical economists like Ricardo and Marx called rent, being a part of the surplus value generated in production and appropriated by owners of natural resources. Rent is an income stream earned without any expenditure of labor. This is that key point, this is that the exploitation element. And confounds, I would assert, and this, of course, I need to do work on this, is, how did, for example, how did the Soviets perceive Volume 3 of Capital? I mean, you have the Engels, interpretation of it or editing of it, which becomes fairly widely known relative to, sort of Marxist theoretical literature, but in practice, how does that, serve as a kind of interesting problematic issue, particularly when you're trying to go whole hog into a, communist reorganization of land, and then you get to, all of the issues relative to land reform in Russia, and then without trying to rationalize or deal with the Kulak question, you can see where that's headed and into problematic areas. So anyway, that's an aside. Back to the text. In this paper, I have demonstrated that the total rent can be decomposed into two components, differential rent and absolute rent. Differential rent, in turn, can be decomposed into differential rent of the first variety, right? Differential rent 1, which arises from differences in the quality of plots of land. Remember, we went through that long rigmarole about the ABCD plot and the, you know, A as opposed to BCD, blah, blah, blah. And differential rent of the second variety, which arises from the differences in the magnitude of capital investment on different plots of land. It's really consonant with, Ricardo. Absolute rent, on the other hand, arises from the ability of the class of landowners to prevent even the worst quality of land being given gratis for agricultural production. Now, after highlighting the key role played by the price of the agricultural commodity in determining the magnitude of rent, I offered two closures of the model. In the first closure, the price of the commodity is determined by the principle of zero net flow of surplus value from agriculture. This is the argument pursued by Marx in Volume 3, of Capital to absurd to absurd lengths. But if the organic composition of capital is sufficiently lower, than the economy-wide average, this principle of price determination can ensure positive rent on all plots of land. Now, in the second closure, I allow, that is, BASU allows for the explicit role of demand in determining both the output and price of the agricultural commodity. In the second closure, we can dispense with the requirement of lower than average organic composition of capital. Hence, this increases the applicability of the Marxist theory of rent to sectors beyond agriculture and to contemporary times as well. So this is the important modification that can be applied for a whole other bunch of things. As I, as in terms of my amusement, regulatory elements or juridical elements, including, for example, electromagnetic spectrum. Anyway, in this paper, I have worked with a case, Basu has worked with a case where agricultural producers are price takers. This can be easily amended to take account of market power and price making behavior. If the market for the agricultural commodity is dominated by a few firms, then the market price will be higher than the competitive price I have used in section 5. This will imply that the rent on each plot of land, including the worst plot, will be higher. Hence, in terms of the threefold decomposition of total rent that Marx discussed, price-making behavior in the market for the agricultural commodity will lead to higher absolute rent. All the qualitative features of the analysis will remain unchanged. I would like to end, that is, Basu would like to end the paper with two caveats. First, he's abstracted from technological change. Hence, the analysis in the paper is static and only investigates the question of the distribution of a given magnitude of surplus value between capitalists and owners of natural resources. This raises all kinds of, empirical questions. To make the analysis more realistic, one will need to incorporate technological change into the framework. Second, the analysis is in partial equilibrium in orientation. It takes the average rate of profit outside agricultural production as given and investigates the issues of production and distribution of surplus value within agriculture. To make the analysis more robust, it will be necessary to extend it to a general equilibrium setting where the average rate of profit and rent is jointly determined by demand and technology. This is, may address Romer's questions. Anyway, I know that seems somewhat schematic and perhaps not even very useful, but Basu is there for your pleasure. Now, I've included the volume 3, the transformation of surplus profit into ground rent, for comparison to what we've been reading all the way up until yesterday on from the Capital volume 3, the folks Mosley translation, and now I've included, just for comparison, and I won't go through it because otherwise we'll just beat ourselves to death. And I'll just skip to the 1844. You can read this at your leisure. This is the Part 6, Volume 3, Transformation of Surplus Profit into Ground Rent, from the 1894. Note, of course, that Marx dies in 1883. This is the Capital Volume 3, The Process of Capitalist Production as a Whole, edited by Frederick Engels and completed by him 11 years after Marx's death. And this is the one that's online, and it has, lots of other stuff, corrections and online versions and PDFs and etc. And 46 is building site rent in mining and price of land. And I suppose we can read this at another juncture, but let me skip ahead and go to 1844, because this is 20 years before Marx does the manuscripts that do volume three. And, this is 20 years of thinking about this, I suppose. And one of the issues for many post World War II readers of Marx is the issue of the early versus the late Marx, and other the so-called humanist Marx, and blah blah blah. I'm not going to talk about that here. I'm just going to read the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 on the rent of land. Note that there's a kind of different voice here, and this is Marx. He's thinking about this before some of the major upheaval in Europe of 1848, etc. Rent of land. Landlord's right has its origin in robbery. JB say, right? So the landlords, like all other men, love to reap what they've never sowed and demand a rent even for the natural produce of the earth. Adam Smith, Volume 1. The rent, quote, the rent of land, it may be thought, is frequently no more than a reasonable profit or interest for the stock laid out by the landlord upon its improvement. This, no doubt, may be partly the case on some occasions. The landlord demands, number one, a rent even for unimproved land, and the supposed interest or profit upon the expense of improvement is generally an addition to this original rent. Number two, those improvements, besides, are not always made by the stock of the landlord, but sometimes by that of the tenant. When the lease comes to be renewed, however, the landlord commonly demands the same augmentation of rent as if they had all been made by his own. Number three, he sometimes demands rent for what is altogether incapable of human improvement. So, you could, and this is Adam Smith, but you could think of this as, close quote, as, sort of gouging. And let me break here for a second. I like the fact that kelp is here because kelp has a whole bunch of other sets of issues, which is useful for some article that eventually will get written on kelp farming in the modern and the contemporary context versus kelp farming in the 19th century. Anyway, Smith cites as an instance of the last case kelp. Quote, a species of seaweed which, when burnt, yields an alkaline salt, useful for making glass, soap, etc. It's also useful for other things, as we know. It grows in several parts of Great Britain, particularly in Scotland, upon such rocks only as lie within the high water mark, which are twice every day covered with the sea, and of which the produce, therefore, was never augmented by human industry. The landlord, however, whose estate is bounded by a kelp shore of this kind, demands a rent for it as much as for his cornfields. The sea in the neighborhood of the islands of Shetland is more than commonly abundant in fish, which make a great part of the subsistence of their inhabitants. But in order to profit by the produce of the waters, they must have a habitation upon the neighboring land. The rent of the landlord is in proportion not to what the farmer can make by the land, but what he can make both by the land and by the water. That's Adam Smith, close quote. This rent may be considered, this is still Smith, right? Quote, this rent may be considered as the produce of those powers of nature, the use of which the landlord lends to the farmer. It is greater or smaller according to the supposed extent of those powers, or in other words, according to the supposed nature or improved fertility of the land. It is the work of nature which remains after deducting or compensating everything which can be regarded as the work of man. Close quote. And Smith continues, quote, now the rent of land, therefore, considered as the price paid for the use of the land, is naturally a monopoly price. It is not at all proportioned to what the landlord may have laid out on the improvement of the land or to what he can afford to take, but to what the farmer can afford to give. So you can see the inversion there. Close quote. Back to Marx. We have already learnt that the size of the rent depends on the degree of the fertility of the land. Another factor in its determination is situation. Quote, this now Smith again, the rent of land not only varies with its fertility, whatever be its produce, but with its situation, whatever be its fertility. Adam Smith. Quote, the, the the produce of land, mines, and fisheries, when their natural fertility is equal, is in proportion to the extent and proper application of the capitals employed about them. When the capitals are equal and equally well applied, it is in proportion to their natural fertility. Close quote. Now, these propositions of Smith are important. This is back to Marx. Because given equal costs of production and capital of equal size, they reduce the rent of the land to the greater or lesser fertility of the soil, thereby showing clearly the perversion of concepts in political economy, which turns the fertility of land into an attribute of the landlord. Now, however, let us consider the rent of land as it is formed in real life. The rent of land is established as a result of the struggle between tenant and landlord. You see, Marx already has the sense of the social relation, right? Recall that this is, during, Marx is looking around for material stuff, and the struggle between tenant and landlord is represents a relation that is subsumptive in that sense. We find that the hostile antagonism of interest, the struggle, the war, is recognized throughout political economy as the basis of social organization. Let us see now what the relations are between landlord and tenant. Quote, in adjusting the terms of the lease, the landlord endeavors to leave him no greater share of the produce than what is sufficient to keep up the stock from which he furnishes the seed, pays the labor, and purchases and maintains the cattle and other instruments of husbandry, together with the ordinary profits of farming stock in the neighborhood. Now, this is evidently the smallest share with which the tenant can content himself without being a loser, and the landlord seldom means to leave him any more. Now, whatever part of the produce, or what is the same thing, whatever part of its price is over and above this share, he naturally endeavors to reserve to himself as the rent of his land, which is evidently the highest the tenant can afford to pay in actual circumstances of the land. This portion, however, may be still considered as the natural rent of land, or the rent for which is naturally meant that the land should, for the most part, be let. Adam Smith, right? Close quote. The landlords, says J.B. Say, operate a certain kind of monopoly against the tenants. The demand for their commodity, site, and soil can go on expanding indefinitely, but there is only a given, limited amount of their commodity. The bargain struck between landlord and tenant is always advantageous to the former, that is, to the landlord, in the greatest possible degree. Besides the advantage he derives from the nature of the case, he derives a further advantage from his position, his larger fortune, and greater credit and standing. So this is a wealth definition, right? Anyway, but the first by itself suffices to enable him and him alone to profit from the favorable circumstances of the land. The opening of a canal or a road, the increase of population, and of the prosperity of a district always raises the rent. Indeed, the tenant himself may improve the ground at his own expense, but he only derives the profit from this capital for the duration of his lease, with the expiry of which it remains with the proprietor of the land. Henceforth, it is the latter who reaps the interest thereon, the proprietor, that is, without having made the outlay, for there is now a proportionate increase in the rent. Close quote, J.B. Say. Quote, This is Smith. Rent, considered as the price paid for the use of the land, is naturally the highest which the tenant can afford to pay in the actual circumstances of the land. Close quote. That's still Smith. The rent of an estate above ground commonly amounts to what is supposed to be a third of the gross produce, and is generally a rent certain and independent of the occasional variations in the crop. Close quote. This rent is seldom less than a fourth of the whole produce. So, you know, what Marx is doing is reading Smith, trying to figure out, well, what quantitatively is going on? How does Smith actually try to measure rent? So back to Marx. Rent cannot be paid on all commodities. For instance, in many districts, no rent is paid for stones. Very, very English, very British. Such a quote, this is Smith. Such parts only of the produce of land can commonly be brought to market, of which the ordinary price is sufficient to replace the stock which must be employed in bringing them thither, together with its ordinary profits. If the ordinary price is more than this, the surplus part of it will naturally go to the rent of the land. If it is not more, though the commodity may be brought to market, it can afford no rent to the landlord. Whether the price is or is not more depends upon the demand. See, we have this sufficient demand of which Basu was also talking about. Close quote. Another quote from Smith. Rent, if it is to be observed, therefore, enters into the composition of the price of commodities in a different way from wages and profit. High or low wages and profit are the causes of high or low price. High or low rent is the effect of it. So you can already see here what's going on, cause, effect, the same kinds of things that Marx himself is going to consider relative to the idea of production and circulation. So anyway, close quote. So back to Marx. Food belongs to the products which always yield a rent. And then a long quote that goes on, but it is Adam Smith. As men, like all other animals, naturally multiply in proportion to the means of their subsistence, food is always, more or less, in demand. It can always purchase or command a greater or smaller quantity of labor, and somebody can always be found who's willing to do something in order to obtain it. The quantity of labor, indeed, which it can purchase is not always equal to what it can maintain, if managed in the most economical manner, or account of the high wages which are sometimes given to labor. But it can always purchase such a quantity of labor as it can maintain, according to the rate at which the sort of labor is commonly maintained in the neighborhood. Another Smith quote, but land, in almost any situation, produces a greater quantity of food than what is sufficient to maintain all the labor necessary for bringing it to market in the most liberal way in which that labor is ever maintained. The surplus, too, is always more than sufficient to replace the stock which employed that labor, together with its profits. Something, therefore, always remains for a rent to the landlord. Close quote. Smith again. Food in this manner not only the original source of rent, but every other part of the produce of land which afterwards affords rent, derives that part of its value from the improvement of the powers of labor in producing food by means of the improvement and cultivation of land. Close quote. Smith. Smith again. Human food seems to be the only produce of land which always and necessarily affords some rent to the landlord. More Smith, quote, countries are populous not in proportion to the number of people whom their produce can clothe and lodge, but in proportion to that of those whom it can feed, close quote. More Smith, after food clothing, and lodging are the two great wants of mankind. They usually yield a rent, but not inevitably. Let us now see how the landlord exploits everything from which society benefits. Number one, the rent of land increases with population. This is still Smith. Number two, we have already learned from J.B. Say, how the rent of land increases with railways, etc., with the improvement, safety, and multiplication of the means of communication. Number three, every improvement in the circumstances of the society tends either directly or indirectly to raise the real rent of land, to increase the real wealth of the landlord, his power of purchasing the labor or the produce of the labor of other people. More quotes. The extension of improvement and cultivations tends to raise it directly. The landlord's share of the produce necessarily increases with the increase of the produce. That rise in the rent and the real price of those parts of the rude produce of land, the rise in the price of cattle, for example, tends to raise the rent of land directly and in a still greater proportion. The real value of the landlord's share, his real command of the labor of other people, not only rises with the real value of the produce, but the proportion of his share to the whole produce rises with it. That produce, after the rise in its real price, requires no more labor to collect it than before. See, this is the idea of surplus, right? A smaller proportion of it will, therefore, be sufficient to replace with the ordinary profit the stock, which employs that labor. A greater proportion of it must consequently belong to the landlord, close quote, Adam Smith. Now, the greater demand for raw produce and therefore the rise in value may in part result from the increase of population and from the increase of their needs. But every new invention, every new application and manufacture of a previously unused or little used raw material augments rent. Thus, for example, there was a tremendous rise in the rent of coal mines with the advent of the railways, steamships, etc. Now, besides this advantage, which the landlord derives from manufacture, discoveries, and labor, there is yet another, as we shall presently see. Number four, all those improvements in the productive powers of labor, which tend directly to reduce the real price of manufactures, tend indirectly to raise the real rent of land. The landlord exchanges that part of his rude produce, which is over and above his own consumption, of what comes to the same thing, that price of that part of it, for manufactured produce. Whatever reduces the real price of the latter raises that of the former. An equal quantity of the former becomes thereby equivalent to a greater quantity of the latter, and the landlord is enabled to purchase a greater quantity of the latter, and the landlord is enabled, to purchase a greater quantity of the conveniences, ornaments, or luxuries which he has occasion for. Adam Smith, close quote. Now, this is back to Marx. But it's silly to conclude, as Smith does, that since the landlord exploits every benefit which comes to society, the interest of the landlord is always identical with that of society. Mistake, needless to say. In the economic system, under the rule of private property, the interest which an individual has in society is in precisely inverse proportion to the interest society has in him, just as the interest of the usurer in the spendthrift is by no means identical with the interest of the spendthrift. That's why you flip over tables, right? We shall mention only in passing the landlord's obsession with monopoly directed against the landed property of foreign countries, from which the Corn Laws, for instance, originate. Remember, this is before, right? The elimination. Likewise, we shall here pass over medieval serfdom, the slavery in the colonies, and the miserable condition of the country folk, the day laborers in Great Britain. Let us confine ourselves to the propositions of political economy itself. Number one, this is still Marx, right? The landlord being interested in the welfare of society means, according to the principles of political economy, that he's interested in the growth of its population and manufacture, in the expansion of its needs, in short, in the increase of wealth. And this increase of wealth is, as we've already seen, identical with the increase of poverty and slavery. The relation between increasing house rent and increasing poverty is an example of the landlord's interest in society. For the ground rent, the interest obtained from the land on which the house stands goes up with the rent of the house. Number two, according to the political economists themselves, the landlord's interest is inimically opposed to the interest of the tenant farmer and thus already to a significant section of society. See, he was already thinking about the antagonisms. Anyway, number three, as the landlord can demand all the more rent from the tenant farmer, the less wages the farmer pays. And as the farmer forces down wages all the lower, the more rent the landlord demands. It follows that the interest of the landlord is just as hostile, right? Remember antagonisms, hostile to that of the farm workers as is that of the manufacturers to their workers. He likewise forces down wages to the minimum. All quite modern. Number four, since a real reduction in the price of manufactured products raises the rent of land, the landowner has a direct interest in lowering the wages of industrial workers in competition amongst the capitalists in overproduction, with all the misery associated with industrial production. Number five, while thus the landlord's interest, far from being identical with the interests of society, stands inimically opposed to the interest of tenant farmers, farm laborers, factory workers, and capitalists. On the other hand, the interest of one landlord is not even identical with that of another, on the account of the competition which we will now consider. In general, the relationship of large and small landed property is like that of big and small capital. But in addition, there are special circumstances which lead inevitably to the accumulation of large landed property and to the absorption of small property by it. Number one, nowhere does the relative number of workers and implements decrease more with increases in the size of the stock than in landed property. Likewise, the possibility of all-round exploitation, of economizing production costs, and of effective division of labor increases nowhere more with the size of the stock than in landed property. However small a field may be, it requires for its working a certain irreducible minimum of implements, plows, saws, etc., whilst the size of a piece of landed property can be reduced far below this minimum. Number two, big landed property accumulates to itself the interest on the capital which the tenant farmer has employed to improve the land. Small landed property has to employ its own capital and therefore does not get this profit at all. Number three, while every social improvement benefits the big estate, it harms small property because it increases its need for ready cash. Number four, two important laws concerning this competition remain to be considered. A, the rent of the land, of the cultivated land, of which the produce is human food, regulates the rent of the greater part of the other cultivated land. That's Adam Smith. Ultimately, only the big estate can produce such food as cattle, etc. Therefore, it regulates the rent of other land and can force it down to a minimum. The small landed proprietor working on his own land stands then to the big landowner in the same relation as an artisan possessing his own tools to the factory owner. Small property and land has become a mere instrument of labor. Rent entirely disappears for the small proprietor. There remains to him, at the most, the interest on his capital and his wages, for rent can be driven down by competition till it is nothing more than the interest on capital not invested by the proprietor. Beta, the above was alpha, beta. In addition, we've already learned that with equal fertility and equally efficient exploitation of lands, mines, and fisheries, the produce is proportionate to the size of the capital, hence the victory of the big landowner. Similarly, where equal capitals are employed, the product is proportionate to the fertility, hence Where capitals are equal, victory goes to the proprietor of the more fertile soil. A mine of any kind may be, Smith, this is Smith, a mine of any kind can be said to be either fertile or barren according as the quantity of mineral which may be brought from it by a certain quantity of labor is greater or less than what can be brought by an equal quantity from the greater part of other mines of the same kind. Close quote, Adam Smith. Quote, the most fertile coal mine, too, regulates the price of coal at all the other mines in the neighborhood. Both the proprietor and the undertaker of the work find that the one that he can get a greater rent, the other that he can get a greater profit by somewhat underselling all their neighbors. Their neighbors are soon obliged to sell at the same price, although they cannot so well afford it, and though it always diminishes and sometimes takes away altogether both their rent and their profit. Some works are abandoned altogether. Others can afford no rent and can be wrought only by the proprietor. Close quote, Adam Smith. More Smith, quote, after the discovery of the mines of Peru, the silver mines of Europe were, the greater part of them, abandoned. This was the case, too, with the mines of Cuba and Santo Domingo, and even with the ancient mines of Peru after the discovery of those of Potosi. Close quote. Still Smith. Back to Marx. What Smith here says of mines applies more or less to landed property generally, dealt at the ordinary market price of land. If it is to be observed, depends everywhere upon the ordinary market rate of interest. If the rent of land should fall short of the interest of money by a greater difference, nobody would buy land, which would soon reduce its ordinary price. On the contrary, if the advantages should much more than compensate the difference, everybody would buy land, which again would soon raise the ordinary price. That's Smith, close quote. From this relation of rent of land to interest on money, this is Marx. From this relation of rent of land to interest on money, it follows that rent must fall more and more, so that eventually only the wealthiest people can live on rent. Hence, the ever greater competition between landowners who do not lease their land to tenants. Downton Abbey, whatever. Ruin of some of these, further accumulation of large landed property. Now, still Marx, this competition has the further consequence that a large part of landed property falls into the hands of the capitalists, and the capitalists thus become simultaneously landowners, just as the smaller landowners are, on the whole, already nothing more than capitalists. Similarly, a section of large landowners become at the same time industrialists. The final consequence is thus the abolition of the distinction between capitalists and landowners, so that there remain altogether only two classes of the population, the working class and the class of capitalists. This huckstering with landed property, the transformation of landed property into a commodity, constitutes the final overthrow of the old and the final establishment of the money aristocracy. There's a lot there. Number one, we will not join the sentimental tears wept over this by Romanticism. Romanticism always confuses the shamefulness of huckstering the land with the perfectly rational consequence, inevitable and desirable within the realm of private property, of the huckstering of private property in land. In the first place, feudal landed property is already by its very nature huckstered land. The royals, the earth which is estranged from man and hence confronts him in the shape of a few great lords, owning most of Scotland. The domination of the land as an alien power over men is already inherent in feudal landed property. The serf is the adjunct of the land. Likewise, the lord of an entailed estate, the firstborn son, belongs to the land. It inherits him. It inherits him, right? Indeed, the dominion of private property begins with the property in land that is its basis. But in feudal landed property, the lord at least appears as the king of the estate. Like Trump, right? Anyway, similarly, there still exists in the semblance of a more intimate connection between the proprietor and the land than that of mere material wealth. The estate is individualized with its lord. It has his rank, is baronial or ducal with him. It has his privileges, his jurisdiction, his political position, etc. It appears as the inorganic body of its lord. Hence the proverb, nulla terre sans maître. There is no land without its master, which expresses the fusion of nobility and landed property. Similarly, the rule of landed property does not appear directly as the rule of mere capital for those belonging to it. The estate is more like their fatherland. It is a constricted sort of nationality. In the same way, the feudal landed property gives its name to its lord, as does a kingdom to its king. His family history, the history of his house, etc. All this individualizes the estate for him and makes it literally his house, personifies it. Similarly, those working on the estate have not the position of day laborers, but they are in part themselves his property, as are serfs, and in part they are bound to him by ties of respect, allegiance, and duty until the until the ice people come. Anyway, his relation to them is therefore directly political and has likewise a human intimate side. Customs, character, etc. vary from one estate to another and seem to be one with the land to which they belong, whereas later it is only his purse and not his character, his individuality, which connects a man with an estate. Finally, the feudal lord does not try to extract the utmost advantage from his land. Rather, he consumes what is there and calmly leaves the worry of producing to the serfs and the tenants. Such is nobility's relationship to landed property, which casts a romantic glory on its lords. It is necessary that this appearance be abolished, that landed property, the root of private property, be dragged completely into the movement of private property, and that it become a commodity, that the rule of the proprietor appear as the undisguised rule of private property of capital, free of all political tincture. The undisguised rule of private property of capital, freed of all political tincture, that the relationship between proprietor and worker be reduced to the economic relationship of, yes, exploiter and exploited. That all personal relationships between the proprietor and his property cease. Property become merely objective material wealth. That the marriage of convenience should take the place of the marriage of honor with the land, and that the land should likewise sink to the status of a commercial value, like man. It is essential that that which is the root of landed property, filthy self-interest, make its appearance too in its cynical form. It is essential that the immovable monopoly turn into the mobile and restless monopoly into competition, and that the idle enjoyment of the products of other people's blood and sweat turn into a bustling commerce in the same commodity. Lastly, it is essential that in this competition, landed property in the form of capital manifests its dominion over both the working class and the proprietors themselves, who are either being ruined or raised by the laws governing the movement of capital. The medieval proverb, nulle terre sans seigneur, there is no land without its lord, is thereby replaced by that of the other proverb, l'argent n'est pas de maître, money knows no master, wherein is expressed the complete domination of dead matter over man. We're close to the end of this, I think. We've already reached close to the end of our time, but we'll see if we can get to the end of this. Concerning number two, concerning the argument of division or non-division of landed property, the following is to be observed. The division of landed property negates the large-scale monopoly of property in land, abolishes it, but not only by generalizing this monopoly, it does not abolish the source of monopoly, that is, private property. property is theft. It attacks the existing form, but not the essence of monopoly. The consequence is that it falls victim to the laws of private property. For the division of landed property corresponds to the movement of competition in the sphere of industry, in addition to the economic disadvantages of such a dividing up of the instruments of labor and the dispersal of labor to be clearly distinguished from the division of labor. In separated labor, the work is not shared out amongst many, but each carries on the same work by himself. It is a multiplication of the same work. This division of land, like that, competition in industry necessarily turns again into accumulation. Therefore, where the division of landed property takes place, there remains nothing for it but to return to monopoly in a still more malignant form, or to negate, to abolish the division of landed property itself. To do that, however, is not to return to feudal ownership, but to abolish private property in the soil altogether. The first abolition of monopoly is always its generalization, the broadening of its existence. The abolition of monopoly, once it has come to exist in its utmost breadth and inclusiveness, is its total annihilation. Association applied to land shares the economic advantage of large-scale landed property and first brings to realization the original tendency inherent in landovage, namely equality. In the same way, association also reestablishes, now on a rational basis, no longer mediated by serfdom, overlordship, and the silly mysticism of property, the intimate ties of man with the earth, since the earth ceases to be an object of huckstering, and through free labor and free enjoyment becomes once more a true personal property of man. Darn those collective farms. A great advantage of the division of landed property is that the masses, which can no longer resign themselves to servitude, perish through property in a different way than in industry. As for large landed property, its defenders have always sophistically identified the economic advantages offered by large-scale agriculture with large-scale landed property, as if it were not precisely as a result of the abolition of property that this advantage for one thing would receive its greatest possible extension, and for another, only then would be of social benefit. In the same way, they have attacked the huckstering spirit of small landed property, as if large landed property did not contain huckstering latent within it, even in its feudal form, not to speak of the modern English form in 1844, which combines the landlord's feudalism with the tenant farmer's huckstering and industry. Just as large landed property can return the reproach of monopoly leveled against it by partitioned land, since partitioned land is also based on the monopoly of private property, so can partition landed property likewise return to large landed property the reproach of partition, since partition also prevails there, although in a rigid and frozen form. Indeed, private property rests altogether on partitioning. See Downton Abbey. Moreover, just as division of the land leads back to large landed property as a form of capital wealth, so must feudal landed property necessarily lead to partitioning, or at least fall into the hands of the capitalists, turn and twist as it may. For large landed property, as in England, drives the overwhelming majority of the population into the arms of industry and reduces its own workers to utter wretchedness. Thus, it engenders and enlarges the power of its enemy, capital, industry, by throwing poor people and an entire activity of the country onto the other side. It makes the majority of the people of the country industrial and thus opponents of large landed property. Where industry has gained to great power, as in England at the present time, it progressively forces from large landed property its monopoly against foreign countries and throws it into competition with landed property abroad. For under the sway of industry, landed property could keep its feudal grandeur secure only by means of monopolies against foreign countries, thereby protecting itself against the general laws of trade, which are incompatible with its feudal character. The Saudis owning Arizona land, for example. Once thrown into competition, landed property obeys the laws of competition like every other commodity subjected to competition. It begins thus to fluctuate, to decrease, to increase, to fly from one hand to another, and no law can keep it any longer in a few predestined hands. The immediate consequence is the splitting up of the land amongst many hands, and in any case, subjection to the power of industrial capitals. Finally, large landed property, which has been forcibly preserved in this way and has begotten by its side a tremendous industry, leads to crisis even more quickly than the partitioning of land, in comparison with which the power of industry remains constantly of second rank. Large landed property, as we see in England, has already cast off its feudal character and adopted an industrial character insofar as it is aiming to make as much money as possible. To the owner, it yields the utmost possible rent. To the tenant farmer, the utmost possible profit on his capital. The workers on the land, in consequence, have already been reduced to the minimum, and the class of tenant farmers already represents within landed property the power of industry and capital. As a result of foreign competition, rent, in most cases, can no longer form an independent income. A large number of landowners are forced to displace tenant farmers, some of whom in this way sink into the proletariat. On the other hand, many tenant farmers will take over landed property for the big proprietors, who, with their comfortable incomes, have mostly given themselves over to extravagance and, for the most part, are not competent to conduct large-scale agriculture, often possess neither the capital nor the ability for the exploitation of the land. Hence, a section of this class, too, is completely ruined. Eventually, wages, which have already been reduced to a minimum, must be reduced yet further to meet the new competition. This then necessarily leads to revolution. Landed property had to develop in each of these two ways so as to experience in both its necessary downfall, just as industry, both in the form of monopoly and in that of competition, had to ruin itself so as to learn to believe in man. So, anyway, got to the end. Thank you very much for your attention. Let us shut down. We've been looking at the 1844 economic and philosophical manuscripts, and just a section on rent because that's what I'm amused by, and just as in we were looking at chapter 6 of the manuscripts of 1864 to 5, which the folks Mosley translation, which is different than what I've included above this, which is the Engels version. And yes, you can, stare at it to your heart's content to compare the two. Um, this is what AI would help with in terms of content analysis, but we're not going to go there just yet. Um, that's for even more antiquarian analysis. And anyway,